Good evening, everybody. It's nice to see you. Nice to be back in New York. Spent 23 years here, and still consider it home. So thank you, Rob, for that kind introduction. Thank you, Sohail, for also helping to organize. Thank you, Gordon Kitt. Thank you, Jane Gaines. Thank you, James Seamus. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. What I want to do are a couple of things. In this book, it's funny when Rob was saying the notion of the ambient Ulmer was still quite resonant, even though the book in question came out in 2014. But for about a decade and a half, when writing the book, I had ambient Ulmer all the time. And in writing of the BFI Film Classics volume on Detour, I think I just had Detour on a loop. And I'm going to be introducing Detour first, and then Ruthless. But before I even get to the scripted remarks, I just want to talk a little bit about this mysterious figure known as Edgar G. Ulmer, somebody who had a way of confusing interviewers and telling different stories at different times, giving different dates of his birth, and so forth. Ulmer was born in Olmütz in Moravia, then still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in September of 1904. He was the eldest of four siblings, and the family very, very quickly, when he was a young boy, moved to Vienna, which was the home of his mother. Henriette Edels was her maiden name. She was an opera singer. His father was a wine merchant, Siegfried, and they moved to the Leopoldstadt. This is the first district in Vienna, which was known for having a very high concentration of Jews from the outer reaches of the Habsburg Empire, who moved there, if not before the Great War, then certainly during and immediately after. Ulmer went to secondary school in Vienna and started a course of study in architecture. But when I was a fellow at the International Research Center for Cultural Studies in the spring of 2003, and when I was doing all the detective work for this book and trying to find all records, there were very, very few records of an Edgar G. Ulmer ever having attended these schools. So it still remains quite a mystery. What we do know, however, is that he, like many aspiring artists, theater people, and eventually film people, he made his way to the Max Reinhardt stage, to the Theater in der Josefstadt in the 8th district of Vienna. And in April of 1924, he traveled across the Atlantic to help with the staging of Max Reinhardt's epic theater production of Das Mirakel, The Miracle, at the Century Theater here on New York's Upper West Side. Very soon after, he made his way west and ended up in the Universal Art Department. And worked there for a number of years, assisted William Wyler on a number of two-reel westerns. And then in 1927, when Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau crossed the Atlantic and made his American debut at Fox Studio with Sunrise, Edgar G. Ulmer and Rochus Gliese were responsible for the set design on that arguably most magnificent of silent movies. In the summer of 1929, Ulmer crossed the Atlantic once more, and this was a transatlantic commute that he was resume after the Second World War as well, doing a number of independent productions in Europe. I may say a few words about that a bit later, but he crossed the Atlantic, and together with a very young Fred Zinnemann, young Billy Wilder, a young Robert Siodmak, and his brother Kurt, they directed what came to be known as one of the most extraordinary independent silent films of the age, Menschen am Sonntag, People on Sunday, that had its premiere in February of 1930 at the Ufa Palast am Kurfürstendamm. Ulmer, with that calling card of having made that co-directed, he picked up the co-director credit with Robert Siodmak. Wilder scripted it, if you can call it that. They basically gathered at the Romanisches Café on Kurfürstendamm. This is where a lot of the artists, theater people, film people gathered, and for a price of for 1 cup of coffee, you could sit all day and read the newspapers that were hanging on the rack. And young Billy Wilder, who was then working as a journalist, wrote down scraps of dialogue, a dialogue on scraps of paper, and they filmed it at the Nikolassee, one of the Great Lakes, just in the bit outside of Berlin, in that fateful summer of 1929. Ulmer returned to the United States and worked again at Universal, and had something of a breakthrough, what seemed to be a very auspicious beginning to a career that unfortunately would never really quite live up to its expectations, with his entry to the Universal horror cycle, The Black Cat, with Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff in 1934. A big mistake on that production was that he fell in love with the then wife of Carl Laemmle's beloved nephew, Max Alexander. This is Shirley, who then became his lifelong collaborator. She ultimately became Shirley Ulmer. She was born Shirley Castle, and was a script supervisor on nearly all of his subsequent films. But because of that, he became essentially blackballed. And we're going to see Let Our People Go, one of the 4 extant tuberculosis films that he directed in the 1940s, but Ulmer's very circuitous path, filled with detours, and I'll say much more about that picture in just a second, led him then from Hollywood to Canada. He shot at Quota Quickie from 9 to 9, made his way east, directed 2, very timely right now, of course, 2 Ukrainian pictures in rural New Jersey, 2 operettas, Cossacks in Exile and Natalka Poltavka, the girl from Poltava. 4 Yiddish language. He didn't know Yiddish. He was a German speaker and very much an assimilationist Jew who, again, like all those collaborators on People on Sunday, Wilder, Zinnemann, Siodmak, embraced German culture as their own. But he didn't know Yiddish, and he directed these four Yiddish films, beginning with Greenfields and all the way through Americana, Schatzchen Americana, American Matchmaker. And it interspersed there an adaptation of Fischke the Krummer, Fischke the Lame, one of the great classics of modern Yiddish literature by Mendele Moishe Svoren, Mendele the Book Peddler, as well as The Singing Blacksmith. 4 feature-length Yiddish films, all of them shot in rural New Jersey, Flemington. In certain cases, I mentioned the 2 Ukrainian pictures, they use the same extras and the same exact location, and you can see them if you watch them back to back. Now, getting to the film in question today, after that ethnic intermezzo, as I call it, these sort of songs of exile, Ulmer made his way back to Hollywood. He writes to his wife Shirley from a hotel in Hollywood that he thinks he's struck it big. He has a great conversation with the studio exec at Paramount. He's going to make a remake of The Blue Angel starring Veronica Lake. None of this happens. None of it. Ulmer ends up with a picture deal from Producers Releasing Corporation, PRC, one of the Beehive studios. The letter is sometimes thought to stand not for Producers Releasing Corporation, but for Pretty Rotten Crap. He directs 11 pictures in 4 short years. The apex of that time at Producers Releasing Corporation, working together with Leon Fromke as producer on this picture, together with Martin Mooney, is, of course, the adaptation of Martin Goldsmith's red-hot, fast-stepping number, as the New York Times Book Review called it, Detour. And so now I'm going to speak with you a bit about that production, and maybe I'll come back to, in the introduction of Ruthless, to talk a little bit about Ulmer's later career, if time allows. Detour was budgeted at $87,570. It came in just over $117,000 in the end, a figure that is far higher than the paltry sums often associated with the film. Many critics thought that it couldn't have cost more than $30,000, giving it possibly the smallest production budget in the entire canon of classic film noir. To put into perspective, the shooting of the infamous death house sequence in Wilder's Double Indemnity 1 year prior at Paramount, bankrolled by the studio and kept from the final cut of the picture, reportedly cost more than all of Detour. The death house sequence alone. The number of shooting days is often given as 6. Most accounts, including those given by people on the set, corroborate this claim. But the final budget lists a total of 14 in the studio, perhaps merely to allow for any extra days that might have proven necessary, plus 4 on location. By Ulmer's own account, arguably as unreliable as Al Roberts' voiceover narration in the film was, like most others made for PRC, shot in 6 days, and he was given 15,000 feet of film stock and a shooting ratio of, in Ulmer's words, and speaking with Peter Bogdanovich, 2-to-1, nothing more. Often cast in heroic terms, Ulmer was sometimes thought to possess, like the Grimm brothers, Rumpelstiltskin, the ability to turn straw into gold, or as director John Landis put it in Michel Palm's documentary, Edgar G. Ulmer Man Off Screen from 2004, to create chicken salad out of chicken shit. This meant, among other things, splicing together short ends, maximizing stock footage, borrowing sets from other directors, using his fingers in lieu of a slate to count off a scene, and fitting as much as he possibly could into a single take with very few retakes. Actor Ann Savage, who plays Vera, insists, for example, and I quote, "I don't even recall any retakes, except at the very end when Tom Neal, who plays Al Roberts in the picture, apparently hadn't studied his lines too well and kept blowing it. But with Edgar, we never had retakes." End quote. According to Savage, Ulmer's technique was to do a master shot and then come in and take close-ups. There was not a lot of room for error, or if there were errors, they would have to remain buried in the final cut. As critic Tim Pauline has remarked in his reevaluation of the film in 1982, Detour could surely be adduced as a prime exhibit in defiance of André Gide's dictum that art is born of constraint and dies in freedom. Of course, certain aspects of the film's minimalist aesthetic had to do with the way in which Ulmer chose to adapt Goldsmith's story. As Eddie Muller puts it, Ulmer's vision was to transform the rambling roadside saga into a head trip. The action is literally confined to what's roiling around in Al Roberts' mind. The bulk of screen time is consumed with tortured close-ups of Tom Neal, pondering his miserable luck in the ultimate why me voiceover. Quote, though Muller may overstate the case, Ulmer's heavy use of close-ups and voiceover, not altogether unlike his manipulation of stock footage and rear projection, were without question more than mere stylistic choice or generic convention. It was what he could do to give the film a relatively stylish feel, admittedly with plenty of glimpses of its threadbare or non-existent sets, without breaking the bank. Examples of cost-saving measures. I'm just going to rattle off 3 of them. First, the heavy use of fog, a B director's best friend, to hide the lack of a set. Second, allowing numerous continuity flaws and imperfections to remain buried in the release print. Al hitchhiking in the inverted negative, as if he were in the British Commonwealth, cars driving on the left side of the road. Vera's pinned-up sweater. When Ann Savage is seen hitchhiking in the Mojave Desert, she enters the car, and if you look very closely, as I did, and I make in the BFI Film Classics volume, in that monograph, I did a screen grab, you can see the safety pins to tighten up that sweater. They're plain to see, to show that women really did not hitch rides in 1945. Third, replacing Duke Ellington's Sophisticated Lady, also once slated for use in Otto Preminger's Laura, for the Tin Pan Alley number, I Can't Believe That You're in Love With Me, which managed to lop off a cool $2,000 off the budget. As the director, by then on a one-picture contract at PRC, as the director, by then on the one picture contract at PRC, Ulmer needed no reminding of the studio's lack of money. Throughout his career, he hustled to make ends meet, eking out a living by showing unremitting resourcefulness and little sense of financial entitlement. Ulmer's director fee for Detour, as listed on the official PRC budget, was a mere $750, the equivalent of less than $12,000 today when adjusted for inflation. In a sense, then, like Al Roberts, he had to thumb his way through the production, taking riffs here and there, cheating his way with an occasional shortcut when the straight and narrow just wouldn't do. As the contemporary German filmmaker Wim Wenders remarks in the 2004 Ulmer documentary, commenting on the severe lack of resources Ulmer often faced, and I quote now from Wenders, "You always think that one needs a lot of money to make films, but in the end, the more money you have, the less you can do with it." End quote. Without the cushion of a generous budget, so Wenders claims, one is forced to compensate with camera work, ideas, abstraction, and to invent the picture when you cannot afford it. To invent the picture when you cannot afford it. And I just want to make note, given the topic of this festival, a couple of the cuts that Ulmer also did. So the source novel by Martin Goldsmith, each chapter rotates from Al's perspective to Sue's perspective. In a film of 67, 68 minutes, we really just have Al's perspective. Sue has very little screen time, very precious few lines of dialogue. But for the more precise subject of this festival, it also meant cutting any characters who had explicit Jewish traits or attributes. Manny Fleischmeyer, for instance, Sue's agent, Mr. Bloomberg, the owner of the hash house at which Sue now works when she makes her way west. And of course, Al Roberts, who in the novel is originally born Aaron Rothenberg and then becomes Aaron Roth, and thinks that Rothenberg, if you just get rid of the Berg or the Thenberg, then suddenly you've made it, you've assimilated. But of course, in the film itself, is really stripped of any ethnic identity as Al Roberts. I can say a bit more about that as well. In the many decades since its release, Detour has accumulated more than its share of champions among critics, fans, and filmmakers. In his highly influential 1968 publication, American Cinema, Andrew Sarris, who formerly taught here at Columbia University, dubbed it a poetic conceit from Poverty Row. While some 40 years later, after the film made its way into the National Film Registry at the Library of Congress, first movie ever to earn that distinction, Roger Ebert hailed Detour as an embodiment of the guilty soul of film noir. For Ulmer, it was by far his best-known film, one that he even hoped to remake late in life. In 1968, relatively soon after Peter Bart published his New York Times profile on the director, titled How to Be a Loner in Hollywood, Ulmer wrote a new screenplay called The Loser, which took the plot lines of Detour and set them against the backdrop of late 60s counterculture and hippies in San Francisco. A Juilliard-trained rocker fills in for Al Roberts, making a similar journey from Greenwich Village to Southern California and encountering the same kind of mysterious death and sexual intrigue along the way. The screenplay, although registered with the Screenwriters Guild, was never made. In 2008, Brazilian director Walter Salles published his Notes on a Theory of the Road movie in the New York Times Magazine, in which he singled out Detour for its poignant account of a country plagued with individualism and greed. While Martin Scorsese in his BFI documentary, A Personal Journey with Martin Scorsese Through American Movies from 1995, championed the film almost as a kind of shorthand definition of the entire mood of film noir. Detour has, at this point, become more than a film, observed critic Kent Jones in a more recent dossier devoted to the film. It is now a classic of the authentically down and out, the ultimate corrective to Hollywood gloss. Enjoy the show. Thank you very much.